The sky over Okinawa. April 15th, 1945. Marine Second Lieutenant Philip DeLong pushed his F4U Corsair into a climbing turn, his eyes scanning the horizon through salt-stained plexiglass. Below him, the invasion fleet stretched across the East China Sea like a steel carpet, thousands of ships supporting the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Above him, 6 dark shapes materialized from the clouds, sunlight glinting off polished aluminum. Zeros. 6 against 1. DeLong checked his fuel gauge, calculated distances, and made his decision. 8 minutes later, all 6 Japanese fighters would be falling toward the ocean, and the myth of the Zero's invincibility would die with them in the cold Pacific waters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had told themselves a comforting lie. The American Corsair, they insisted, was fast in a straight line but clumsy in combat. Too heavy, too rigid, built for speed but not for fighting. This belief persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary, despite the growing list of aces flying the bent-wing bird, despite the sobering reality that Corsairs kept appearing over every battlefield while Zeros grew scarcer. The psychological need to believe in their own aircraft's superiority overrode the tactical lessons written in blood across the Pacific sky. Japanese training manuals from 1944 and early 1945 still emphasized the Zero's advantages in turning combat, instructing pilots to lure American fighters into dogfights, where Japanese maneuverability would prevail. These manuals acknowledged the Corsair's speed and climb rate, but characterized these as limitations rather than advantages, calling the American fighter suitable only for hit-and-run tactics and incapable of sustained, maneuvering combat. This assessment reflected wishful thinking more than battlefield reality, a desperate attempt to maintain confidence in equipment that was being systematically outclassed. The roots of this delusion stretched back to 1942 and the Zero's early dominance. When the Mitsubishi A6M first encountered Allied fighters over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, its superiority was overwhelming and undeniable. The Zero could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange every Allied fighter in the theatre. American Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, British Hawker Hurricanes, Dutch Brewster B-339 seconds, all fell before the Zero's combination of lightweight, powerful engine, and exceptional maneuverability. Japanese pilots racked up kill ratios that seemed almost supernatural, with some aces claiming dozens of victories in their first months of combat. This early success created a dangerous mythology, a belief that Japanese aircraft design philosophy was inherently superior to Western approaches. That philosophy prioritized maneuverability and range above all else. The Zero achieved its legendary turning ability through radical weight reduction, eliminating armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy structure in favor of agility and endurance. The result was an aircraft that could outmaneuver any opponent in slow-speed turning combat and fly missions of extraordinary range. 6 M20s escorted Japanese bombers from Formosa to the Philippines, a round trip of over 1,000 miles, something American fighters of 1941 could not accomplish. When American pilots tried to dogfight Zeros on Japanese terms, engaging in slow-speed turning combat, they died. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to validate every assumption Japanese designers had made. But warfare is evolution, and the Americans were learning. By mid-1942, surviving American pilots had developed new tactics, specifically designed to negate the Zero's advantages. The Thach weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thach, used pairs of fighters in mutual support, preventing Zeros from exploiting their turning ability. Boom and zoom tactics, diving on Japanese fighters from superior altitude, firing, and using speed to escape before the Zero could respond, transformed American disadvantages into advantages. The key insight was simple but revolutionary. Never fight the Zero on its terms. Never engage in turning combat. Use speed, altitude, and teamwork to control the engagement. By the time the Corsair reached operational units in early 1943, American tactical doctrine had evolved far beyond the desperate defensive fighting of 1942. The Corsair was purpose-built for this new tactical reality. Where the Zero sacrificed everything for agility, the Corsair was engineered for speed, firepower, and survivability. The massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. This power translated into performance that Japanese fighters simply could not match. The Corsair could reach 417 miles per hour in level flight, climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, and dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. More critically, it could sustain high-speed maneuvering that would tear the wings off a Zero. The structural strength that Japanese pilots dismissed as excessive weight was actually sophisticated engineering, allowing the Corsair to pull high-G maneuvers at speeds where Japanese fighters had to slow down or risk structural failure. The armament disparity was equally profound. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings with clear fields of fire, could pour out devastating volumes of fire. Each gun cycled at approximately 800 rounds per minute, meaning the Corsair could deliver nearly 5,000 rounds per minute when all 6 guns fired simultaneously. The combined weight of fire from a 1-second burst equaled roughly 6 pounds of projectiles, enough to saw through aircraft structure, destroy engines, and kill pilots instantly. Japanese fighters, even later models, typically mounted 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, providing less total firepower with slower rates of fire. When a Corsair's guns found their target, the result was catastrophic and immediate. But firepower and speed meant nothing without pilots capable of exploiting these advantages. The American pilot training pipeline in 1944 and 45 was producing aviators with 300 to 400 hours of flight time before they reached combat squadrons, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, and tactical instruction. Japanese training programs, strangled by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors, were producing pilots with barely 50 to 100 hours of total flight time, minimal gunnery practice, and almost no advanced tactical training. The disparity in pilot quality compounded the aircraft performance gap, creating a lethal combination that Japanese fighters could not overcome. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Philip DeLong represented this new breed of American naval aviator. Born in 1923 in Pennsylvania, he had grown up during the Depression watching barnstormers at county fairs, dreaming of flight. When war came, he enlisted in the Navy's aviation cadet program, driven by a combination of patriotism and the simple desire to fly. His training began in early 1943 at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, where he learned basic flight in Navy trainers, mastering takeoffs, landings, and fundamental aeronautics. He proved a natural pilot, with smooth hands on the controls and good spatial awareness, qualities that marked him for fighter training. Advanced training at Naval Air Station Jacksonville introduced DeLong to high-performance aircraft, gunnery, and combat tactics. He flew hundreds of practice missions, learning deflection shooting, altitude management, and formation discipline. His instructors were combat veterans from Guadalcanal, Midway, and the Coral Sea, men who had fought Zeros and lived to teach others how to win. They drilled into their students the fundamental principles: maintain speed, maintain altitude, use teamwork, never turn with a Zero, shoot accurately, and get out. These lessons, repeated until they became instinct, would save American lives across the Pacific. DeLong received his wings and commission in late 1943 and was assigned to Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 323, the Death Rattlers. The squadron formed at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, building unit cohesion, through intensive training before deploying overseas. DeLong flew his first combat missions in early 1944 during the Marshall Islands campaign, flying escort for bombers and conducting ground attack missions against Japanese positions. These early missions were educational rather than dramatic, learning how to navigate over water, manage fuel consumption, coordinate with other aircraft, and deal with the physical and mental stress of combat flying. His first aerial victory came during a mission over Truk in February 1944. Escorting Marine bombers attacking the massive Japanese naval base, DeLong's flight encountered Zero fighters attempting to intercept the bombers. Following doctrine, the Corsairs maintained altitude and speed, diving through the Japanese formation in coordinated pairs. DeLong locked onto a Zero that had committed to attacking a bomber, closing to 300 yards before opening fire. His tracers walked across the Zero's wing route, and the Japanese fighter exploded instantly as bullets found the unprotected fuel tank. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds, boom and zoom executed perfectly. DeLong felt neither triumph nor horror, only professional satisfaction at having done his job correctly. By April 1945, DeLong had flown over 100 combat missions and accumulated 4 confirmed aerial victories. He was no longer a novice learning his trade, but an experienced combat pilot who understood both his aircraft and his enemy. The Death Rattlers had relocated to Kadena Airfield on Okinawa, flying constant missions supporting ground troops, attacking Japanese positions, and providing combat air patrol over the invasion fleet. The squadron was exhausted, flying multiple missions daily, losing aircraft to ground fire, accidents, and the occasional Japanese fighter that managed to reach them. Sleep came in brief intervals between missions. Food was whatever you could grab, and the constant stress of combat flying wore on everyone. The morning of April 15th began like any other. DeLong woke before dawn, pulled on his flight suit, grabbed coffee and a sandwich from the mess tent, and walked to the flight line for the mission briefing. The operations officer outlined the day's assignment: combat air patrol over the fleet anchorages at Hagushi Bay. Intelligence reported increased Japanese air activity, likely preparation for another mass kamikaze attack. The Death Rattlers would maintain station at 15,000 feet, positioned to intercept any Japanese aircraft attempting to reach the fleet. It was routine defensive work, boring and exhausting, requiring constant vigilance while nothing happened for hours at a time. DeLong's Corsair that morning was Bureau number 82385, an F4U 1D model that he had flown before, reliable and familiar. He walked around the aircraft during pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, examining tires, ensuring ammunition boxes were full and properly seated. The plane captain, a young enlisted mechanic who maintained this aircraft, stood by anxiously, pride invested in his work. Everything checked out perfectly. DeLong climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and went through the starting sequence. The R2800 engine coughed, fired, and settled into a smooth, powerful rumble that vibrated the entire airframe. He checked instruments, tested controls, and signaled he was ready for taxi. 4 Corsairs took off in pairs, DeLong flying wing position on his section leader. They climbed away from Okinawa, heading west over the East China Sea toward their patrol station. Below them, the invasion fleet covered dozens of square miles, hundreds of ships ranging from massive battleships and carriers to tiny landing craft. Destroyers on radar picket duty ringed the formation, positioned as early warning stations for incoming Japanese aircraft. Above them, layers of American fighters maintained constant patrol: F-6F Hellcats, F4U Corsairs, and P-38 Lightnings stacked at different altitudes, creating an aerial barrier between the fleet and Japanese airfields on Kyushu and Formosa. DeLong settled into the routine of combat air patrol, scanning sectors of sky methodically, checking his instruments periodically, staying alert despite the monotony. An hour passed. Nothing happened. The radio crackled occasionally with routine position reports from other flights. The sun climbed higher, heating the cockpit until sweat soaked his flight suit. He shifted position, trying to stay comfortable while maintaining vigilance. Combat flying was 95% boredom and 5% terror, and right now he was experiencing the 95%. Then his section leader's voice cracked over the radio, urgent and controlled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, 6 contacts, coming down. DeLong's eyes snapped to the indicated position, and there they were, 6 dark shapes diving out of the sun, classic Japanese tactics. His pulse accelerated, adrenaline flooded his system, and his hands moved automatically to prepare for combat. The section leader called for the division to break and engage, standard doctrine against superior numbers. But then the leader's engine began trailing smoke, hit by ground fire from their own ships below, or perhaps a mechanical failure. The cause irrelevant. His leader turned away, calling that he was heading back to base, leaving DeLong alone with 6 Japanese fighters diving toward him. Every calculation changed in an instant. 6 against 1. His training screamed at him to disengage, to dive away using superior speed, to retreat and regroup with friendly forces. Combat doctrine emphasized teamwork and mutual support, specifically warning against engaging multiple opponents alone. But below him, the fleet stretched across the horizon, hundreds of ships packed with thousands of American sailors and Marines. If these 6 Japanese fighters broke through, if they reached at anchorage, the consequences would be measured in burning ships and dead men. DeLong made his decision in the heartbeat between recognizing the threat and responding to it. He would not run. He would not let them through. 6 against 1, but he had advantages they could not match. The lead Zero was already committed to its dive. The pilot focused on reaching the fleet below, probably not even aware that 1 American fighter remained above him. DeLong rolled inverted and pulled through, diving after the Japanese formation. His Corsair accelerated rapidly, the massive engine pulling him downward at terrifying speed. 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. The Zero in his gun sight was doing perhaps 350, fast for a Japanese fighter but hopelessly inadequate against a diving Corsair. The geometry simplified into pure mathematics: closure rate, deflection angle, trigger time. At 400 yards, he could see the Zero clearly, dark green paint, with red Hinomaru circles on wings and fuselage. 300 yards. The Japanese pilot still had not seen him, focused entirely on the ships below. At 250 yards, DeLong squeezed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns hammered, their combined recoil shaking the entire aircraft. Tracers arced toward the Zero, appearing to curve lazily through the air before accelerating into the target. The first burst missed, passing just behind the Zero's tail. DeLong adjusted his aim slightly, compensating for the closure rate, and fired again. This time his bullets walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Japanese fighter seemed to stagger in mid-air, pieces flying off the empennage. Smoke poured from the engine. The Zero rolled left, either from pilot control or structural damage, and began spinning downward. DeLong did not watch it fall. First kill. 5 remaining. The other Zeros had reacted now, breaking formation, their advantage of surprise lost. DeLong had expected this. He had studied Japanese tactics, understood how their pilots thought. They would try to slow him down, force him into a turning fight where their superior maneuverability could compensate for his speed. He would not give them that opportunity. He kept his speed high, pulling up from his dive in a climbing turn that used his energy advantage. 2 Zeros turned hard, trying to follow him, but their lighter airframes could not sustain high-G maneuvers at this speed. They had to slow down or risk structural failure, the fundamental limitation of their design philosophy. DeLong rolled out at the top of his climb, now above the scattered Japanese formation again. He had regained the altitude advantage, the most precious commodity in air combat. Altitude could be converted to speed, speed could be converted to positioning, positioning could be converted to kills. He selected his next target, a Zero that had separated slightly from its companions while trying to follow his climb. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and turned hard left, the Zero rotating impossibly tight, trying to bring its guns to bear. But DeLong was not trying to turn with him. He adjusted his dive angle slightly, accepting a more difficult deflection shot rather than following the Zero into its turn. The physics were unforgiving. The Zero could turn inside his radius, but it could not outrun his bullets. DeLong opened fire at 300 yards, leading the target by what looked like impossible amounts, his tracers appearing to arc wide of the mark. But the Zero was turning into his line of fire, flying into the stream of bullets. 50 caliber rounds struck the Zero's wing root, and the entire wing folded upward, torn off by aerodynamic forces after its structural integrity was compromised. The Zero tumbled, spinning wildly, pieces separating as it fell. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Second kill. 4 remaining. The remaining Japanese pilots were trying to coordinate now, attempting to set up a cross pattern that would force him to fly through at least one of their firing arcs, no matter which way he turned. It was a sound tactic, the kind of thing experienced pilots did when outnumbering an opponent, but it required communication and coordination, and DeLong had no intention of giving them time to organize properly. He chose the nearest Zero and dove at it, accepting that this would bring him close to another Japanese fighter's guns. Speed again. Always speed. The Corsair accelerated past 430 miles per hour, screaming down at the Zero below. This Japanese pilot was good, recognizing the threat immediately and braking hard right while simultaneously diving to build his own speed. It was the correct defensive maneuver, making himself a difficult target while trying to equalize the speed differential. But the Corsair's power advantage was too great. DeLong adjusted his dive, pulling lead, and fired a long burst. Most of his bullets missed, but enough connected. The Zero's engine disintegrated in a spray of metal fragments and oil. Glycol coolant streamed from punctured lines. The Zero's propeller windmilled uselessly as the engine seized. The Japanese pilot kept flying, gliding his crippled aircraft, probably hoping to reach friendly territory, or at least a position where he could ditch near rescue forces. DeLong did not have time to finish him. Third kill, effectively. 3 remaining, all still dangerous. Now the surviving Zeros were pressing their attack with desperate coordination. One dove at him from above, while 2 others converged from opposite sides, attempting to trap him in a crossfire. DeLong's options narrowed. He could not outclimb the high Zero without losing speed, could not turn away from both side attackers simultaneously. But he could do what no Zero could match. He pushed the throttle to emergency power and dove straight down, not at an enemy but at the ocean, using gravity and engine power together to build speed beyond anything the Japanese fighters could achieve. 500 miles per hour, 520. The Corsair's airframe groaned under aerodynamic stress that would have torn a Zero apart, but Chance Vaught's engineers had built this aircraft to withstand exactly these forces. The pursuing Zeros could not follow. They had to throttle back, pull out of their dives early, watch helplessly as the American fighter dropped away from them, building impossible speed. But DeLong was not running. At 3,000 feet he pulled back on the stick, hauling the Corsair through a pullout that greyed his vision and pressed him into his seat with crushing force. 6 Gs. 7. The airframe shuddered but held together. Blood drained from his head, peripheral vision tunneling, but he maintained consciousness through training and conditioning. The Corsair arced through the bottom of its dive and rocketed back upward, all that speed converting back into altitude, climbing at over 4,000 feet per minute. The Zeros had scattered during his dive, losing cohesion, each pilot making individual decisions rather than working as a coordinated team. This was the moment DeLong had created, transforming their numerical advantage into a series of individual engagements. He selected the nearest Zero, now below him again, and dove once more. This Japanese pilot saw him coming and attempted to dive away, mimicking DeLong's own tactic. But the Zero could not match the Corsair's dive speed. DeLong closed rapidly, fired from 200 yards, and watched his tracers shred the Zero's tail section. The Japanese fighter pitched up violently, completely out of control, and snap-rolled into a spin. 4th kill, 2 remaining, time distorted in combat. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt simultaneously much longer and much shorter. DeLong's fuel gauge showed he had burned through reserves at an alarming rate, all that high power, maneuvering, consuming fuel faster than economical crews. His ammunition counters showed approximately half his rounds remaining. 2 enemies left, enough ammunition for both if he shot accurately. The surviving Japanese pilots were now trying to escape, having lost two-thirds of their formation and achieved nothing. One turned south toward Formosa, the other northeast toward Kyushu, splitting up to divide his attention. DeLong chose the one heading northeast, the more immediate threat to the fleet's northern approaches. He turned after the fleeing Zero, settling into pursuit. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and pushed his aircraft to maximum speed, running for home. But maximum speed for a Zero was perhaps 350 miles per hour, and DeLong's Corsair was indicating 410. The gap closed steadily, inexorably. The Zero pilot tried evasive maneuvers, skidding left and right, attempting to throw off DeLong's aim. But these maneuvers bled speed, and speed was the only thing keeping the Zero alive. At 400 yards, DeLong opened fire, a ranging burst. His tracers fell behind the Zero's tail. He adjusted his aim and fired again. This time bullets sparked off the Zero's empennage, causing visible damage but nothing catastrophic. 300 yards. The Japanese pilot was flying desperately now, zigzagging wildly, knowing death was closing from behind. DeLong steadied his aim, leading the target, and fired a sustained burst. 50 caliber rounds hammered into the Zero's fuselage, walking forward from tail to cockpit. The plexiglass canopy shattered. The Zero snapped into a vertical dive and plunged straight into the ocean, hitting the water at over 300 miles per hour. The impact was violent and final. 5th kill. 1 remaining. The last Zero was miles away now, heading south, probably beyond catch. DeLong checked his fuel gauge again and made another calculation. He had enough fuel to pursue for perhaps 2 more minutes before he would have to break off and return to base. 2 minutes at full throttle, maximum distance perhaps 10 miles. The fleeing Zero was already 8 miles away. The mathematics were marginal, but this was the last enemy fighter from the attack group, and if it escaped, it might report on American positions, patrol patterns, defensive tactics. Information was valuable, worth the risk. DeLong firewalled the throttle and turned south in pursuit, pouring maximum power into closing the distance. The Corsair responded eagerly, accelerating past 420 miles per hour. The gap began closing again, slowly, yard by yard. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and tried to coax more speed from his engine, but the Zero had nothing left to give. 7 miles, 6 miles, 5 miles. DeLong's fuel gauge dropped toward minimum reserves, the point beyond which he would not have enough fuel to return to Kadena. He kept pushing. At 4 miles, he could see the Zero clearly, sunlight glinting off its canopy. 3 miles. The Japanese pilot was flying straight and level now, giving up on evasive maneuvers, committing everything to speed. 2 miles. DeLong eased back slightly on the throttle, managing his overtake speed to avoid shooting past the target. 1 mile. The Zero was huge in his gunsight now, every detail visible, the oil streaks on the cowling, the faded paint on the wings, the desperate pilot inside the cockpit. At 800 yards, DeLong opened fire, his remaining ammunition pouring out in a sustained burst. The range was extreme for accurate shooting, but he was not trying to be surgical. He was throwing up a wall of lead, forcing the Zero to fly through it. Tracers reached out across the closing distance. Most missed, falling behind or arcing over the target. But some connected. Bullets struck the Zero's left wing, punching holes through the thin aluminum skin. More rounds hit the fuselage. The Zero began trailing smoke, still flying, still trying to escape, but wounded now. DeLong fired again, exhausting his ammunition, his guns falling silent one by one as ammunition boxes emptied. The Zero was still flying, damaged but not destroyed, limping south trailing smoke. DeLong's guns were empty. His fuel was critically low. He had perhaps 5 minutes of flying time remaining before he would be swimming. The tactical situation was clear. He had to break off. But the Zero was dying, its engine smoking badly, losing altitude gradually. It would not make it home. Good enough. He pulled back on the stick, climbing away, turning back toward Okinawa and the safety of Kadena airfield. Behind him, the damaged Zero continued south for another 3 minutes before its engine seized completely. The Japanese pilot ditched in the ocean 60 miles south of Okinawa, successfully exiting his aircraft but dying of exposure before rescue could arrive, if rescue had even been attempted. Sixth kill. DeLong flew north, his Corsair's fuel gauge now showing below. Minimum reserves, the warning light glowing red. He reduced power to maximum endurance settings, trading speed for range, gliding as much as possible. The mathematics of fuel consumption versus distance were unforgiving. He was not certain he would make it. The coastline of Okinawa appeared ahead, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He called Kadena Tower, reporting his fuel state, and they cleared him for immediate landing. Other aircraft in the pattern gave way, understanding that a fuel emergency took absolute priority. DeLong lined up on final approach, gear down, flaps down, watching his airspeed carefully. The Corsair wanted to float, its high wing loading requiring precise speed control for landing. He crossed the runway threshold, pulled power to idle, and flared. The main gear touched down smoothly, the tail wheel settling a moment later. He rolled out, turned off the runway, and taxied to his revetment. As he shut down the engine, it coughed twice and died. The fuel gauge read 0. He had landed with perhaps 30 seconds of fuel remaining. The plane captain was waiting, staring at the empty ammunition boxes visible through the open gun ports, at the oil and hydraulic fluid streaking the underside of the aircraft, at the stressed metal around the wing roots where high G pullouts had deformed the structure slightly. DeLong climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands trembling from adrenaline come-down. The plane captain asked if everything was okay. DeLong nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he told him to rearm and refuel the aircraft because he had another mission in 4 hours. The intelligence debriefing lasted an hour. DeLong described the engagement in detail. His section leader confirmed the initial contact and DeLong's decision to engage alone, and squadron intelligence officers plotted the action on maps and recorded his statements. 6 enemy aircraft engaged. 6 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. 0 friendly losses. The kill claims would require confirmation, but radar tracks from fleet picket destroyers corroborated DeLong's account, showing 6 contacts disappearing from scopes during the time frame he described. Gun camera footage showed clear kills on 3 aircraft, probable kills on 2 more, and damage to the 6th. All 6 claims were approved. The raw numbers told part of the story. 6 Zeros shot down in 8 minutes by a single pilot. But numbers could not capture what this engagement represented. It was not merely individual skill or courage, though DeLong possessed both. It was the culmination of 3 years of tactical evolution, engineering superiority, and training doctrine all converging in one furious battle. Everything the American war machine had learned about building better aircraft, training better pilots, and developing better tactics found expression in those 8 minutes over the East China Sea. Japanese Naval Air Force Headquarters received reports of the engagement later that day from the rescued pilot who had ditched his damaged aircraft and from radar observations made by Japanese installations on Formosa. The reports described an American fighter engaging multiple A-6M fighters simultaneously and destroying the entire formation. Intelligence officers initially questioned the reports, suspecting exaggeration or confusion, but multiple sources confirmed the essential facts. 1 Corsair, 6 Zeros, complete American victory. The reports circulated through Japanese Naval Aviation Command, reaching pilots preparing for missions the following day. The psychological impact was devastating. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had maintained faith in their aircraft and their skills, believing that superior tactics and warrior spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. Individual engagements where Zeros defeated Corsairs reinforced this belief, even as the overall kill ratios moved inexorably against them. But this engagement shattered comfortable illusions. If one American pilot could destroy 6 Japanese fighters simultaneously, what hope remained? The mathematics of attrition became undeniable. American pilot training programs were producing thousands of competent aviators annually, while Japanese training infrastructure collapsed under bombing and resource shortages. American factories were building aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, while Japanese production withered under strategic bombing and raw material shortages. The engagement over Okinawa on April 15, 1945, became a case study in both American tactical doctrine and Japanese strategic failure. Within days, Marine Corps Aviation Command distributed tactical summaries of the action to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific, using DeLong's engagement as a teaching example. The reports emphasized several key points that validated years of tactical development. First, the importance of maintaining energy advantage through speed and altitude management. DeLong had repeatedly converted altitude to speed and speed back to altitude, using the Corsair's superior power-to-weight ratio to control engagement geometry. Second, the value of aggressive action even when outnumbered. By attacking immediately rather than retreating, DeLong had disrupted Japanese coordination and prevented them from executing their planned attack on the fleet. Third, the criticality of accurate gunnery. DeLong had fired approximately 1,700 rounds to achieve 6 kills, a hit ratio reflecting hundreds of hours of training in deflection shooting and lead calculation. Japanese analyses of the same engagement reached darker conclusions. Naval Air Staff officers reviewing the action recognized that their tactical assumptions had been systematically invalidated. The Zero's maneuverability advantage, so dominant in 1942 and early 1943, no longer provided meaningful combat advantage against properly flown American fighters. The Corsair's ability to control engagement parameters through superior speed made traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. When American pilots refused to engage in turning combat and instead used vertical maneuvers, diving attacks, and zoom climbs, the Zero's strengths became irrelevant while its weaknesses, lack of armor, fragile structure, limited speed, proved fatal. Moreover, the engagement revealed the widening pilot quality gap. The 6 Japanese pilots involved in the April 15th action were not novices. Records indicate they averaged between 8 and 14 months of operational experience, having survived the brutal attrition of 1944 and early 1945. By Japanese standards of this period, they were relatively experienced, yet they had been systematically destroyed by a single American pilot who was himself not particularly exceptional by US Navy and Marine Corps standards. DeLong was a competent fighter pilot, better than average, but not among the legendary aces whose names dominated aviation history. His victory reflected systemic advantages rather than individual genius, which made the implications even more troubling for Japanese commanders. The story of this engagement spread rapidly through both American and Japanese aviation communities, though with vastly different impacts. American pilots absorbed it as confirmation of their tactical superiority and validation of their training. Fighter squadrons used the action as a teaching tool, analyzing DeLong's decisions and discussing alternative approaches. The engagement became part of the growing body of evidence that American fighters, when properly employed, were dominant in Pacific skies. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics, with American pilots actively seeking combat rather than avoiding it. The psychological advantage of knowing your aircraft and tactics were superior proved as valuable as the material advantages themselves. Japanese pilots confronted a different reality. Reports of the engagement circulated informally through ready rooms and barracks, spreading despite official efforts to minimize discussion of such demoralizing incidents. Young pilots preparing for their first missions heard the story and understood its implications. The Americans were not just better equipped, they were better trained, better supported, and employing tactics that Japanese doctrine could not effectively counter. The 6 Zeros destroyed over Okinawa joined thousands of other Japanese aircraft lost during the grinding attrition battles of 1944 and 1945, but this particular loss carried symbolic weight disproportionate to its numerical significance. The broader context of April 1945 made the engagement even more significant. Japan's naval air forces were approaching complete collapse. The disastrous Philippine Sea Battle in June 1944 had destroyed the cream of Japanese naval aviation, killing hundreds of trained pilots in what American aircrews called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Subsequent battles during the Philippines campaign had consumed additional trained aviators at unsustainable rates. By April 1945, Japanese naval air groups were shadows of their former strength, filled with hastily trained pilots flying obsolescent aircraft against overwhelming American numbers and superior technology. The kamikaze campaign represented Japan's acknowledgement of this reality. Unable to compete in conventional aerial combat, Japanese commanders had embraced suicide tactics as their only remaining option for inflicting significant damage on American naval forces. Kamikaze attacks were horrifyingly effective in certain circumstances, exploiting the difficulty of stopping a pilot willing to die to ensure his aircraft hit the target. But kamikaze tactics also represented complete abandonment of professional military aviation. Pilots were no longer trained to fight, survive, and return for another mission. They were trained to die, destroying a single target, transforming trained aviators into guided weapons consumed in a single use. The Okinawa campaign saw kamikaze attacks reach their peak intensity. Over 1,900 Japanese aircraft participated in organized kamikaze missions against American naval forces supporting the invasion, supplemented by hundreds of individual suicide attacks. These attacks sank dozens of American ships and damaged hundreds more, killing thousands of American sailors in some of the most intense naval combat of the Pacific War. But the strategic impact was negligible. American industrial capacity replaced losses faster than kamikazes could inflict them, while Japanese aviation effectively committed suicide as an institution, expending its remaining pilots and aircraft for tactical results that did not alter strategic realities. DeLong's engagement on April 15th occurred against this backdrop of Japanese desperation and American dominance. The 6 Zeros he destroyed had been assigned to escort duty for a planned kamikaze strike against American fleet units. By destroying the escorts before they could reach their assigned positions, DeLong prevented the kamikaze aircraft from receiving fighter protection during their approach. American combat air patrols subsequently intercepted and destroyed most of the unescorted kamikaze aircraft before they could reach the fleet. What might have been a damaging attack became another failed mission. More pilots and aircraft expended for no meaningful result. The human cost of these campaigns was staggering. Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 7,000 aircraft and 4,500 pilots during the Okinawa campaign alone. Most died in kamikaze attacks or were shot down by American fighters during conventional missions. American forces lost approximately 763 aircraft during the same period, with roughly half of those pilots recovering safely. The kill ratios had become so lopsided that combat was no longer warfare in any meaningful sense. It was systematic destruction of one side by the other. Japanese pilots sent into battle with minimal training, obsolescent aircraft, insufficient fuel for training or even combat missions, and tactical doctrine that no longer corresponded to battlefield realities. Individual Japanese pilots faced impossible choices. Many recognized the futility of continued resistance but remained bound by duty, honor, and military discipline. To refuse a mission was unthinkable, even when that mission was clearly suicidal. Japanese military culture emphasized absolute obedience, self-sacrifice, and acceptance of death in service to the emperor. These values had produced extraordinary courage and commitment during Japan's early victories, but by 1945 they had become mechanisms for converting young men into casualties with minimal military benefit. Pilots wrote final letters to families, performed ritual preparations, and flew to their deaths knowing they would not return. DeLong flew 73 more combat missions between April 15th and the end of the war in August 1945. He shot down 3 additional Japanese aircraft, bringing his final total to 9 confirmed aerial victories. He survived the war without serious injury, though his aircraft was hit by ground fire on multiple occasions and suffered various mechanical failures that required emergency landings. After the war, he remained in the Marine Corps for several years before eventually transitioning to civilian life, working as a commercial pilot and eventually as a flight instructor. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, considering aerial combat a professional duty rather than something to celebrate or romanticize. The Corsair he flew on April 15th, Bureau number 82385, continued flying combat missions throughout the Okinawa campaign. It survived the war and was eventually returned to the United States, where it was surplused and sold to civilian owners. The aircraft changed hands several times over the decades, eventually being restored to flying condition by warbird enthusiasts. As of the early 21st century, it was still flying at air shows, one of relatively few surviving Corsairs maintained in airworthy condition. Visitors to these air shows could see the same aircraft that DeLong flew that day, maintained lovingly by people who understood its historical significance. The 6 Japanese pilots DeLong shot down on April 15th remained largely anonymous. Japanese military records from the final months of the war were incomplete, destroyed during the chaos of defeat or lost during the American occupation. Personnel records that might have identified these pilots and told their stories were burned or discarded. They became 6 more names among thousands lost during the Okinawa campaign, their individual stories forgotten except as statistics in after-action reports. They had trained, deployed, fought according to their understanding of duty and honor, and died in service to their country. That their deaths achieved nothing strategically did not diminish their personal courage, or the tragedy of lives ended so young. The technological and tactical lessons of engagements like DeLong's victory on April 15th influenced post-war aviation development profoundly. American aircraft designers absorbed the lessons that speed, firepower, and structural strength were more valuable than extreme maneuverability in modern air combat. Post-war fighters emphasized these characteristics, accepting reduced agility in exchange for superior performance. The jet fighters that emerged in the late 1940s and early 1950s reflected this philosophy, with aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and F-4 Phantom prioritizing speed and firepower over turning ability. Japanese aviation, after rebuilding during the post-war decades, initially adopted American design philosophy wholesale. Early Japanese self-defense force fighters were American designs built under license F-86 Sabres and F-4 Phantoms manufactured in Japan with American technical assistance. Japanese engineers, who had struggled with the Zero's limitations during the war, embraced the American approach, designing aircraft that prioritized pilot protection, robust construction, and overwhelming firepower. Only in later decades did Japanese designers begin developing distinctly Japanese design philosophies again, creating aircraft like the Mitsubishi F2 that blended American technology with indigenous design concepts. The historical debate about whether Japanese aviation could have competed more effectively against American industrial might continues among scholars and aviation enthusiasts. Some argue that different design choices, particularly earlier adoption of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, might have allowed Japanese pilots to survive longer and maintain combat effectiveness. Others contend that material and industrial disparities were so overwhelming that design modifications would have merely postponed inevitable defeat. The Zero's early dominance came from doctrinal choices that accepted extreme vulnerability in exchange for performance advantages. When those advantages became irrelevant due to evolved American tactics, the vulnerabilities proved fatal. What remains undeniable is that individual engagements like DeLong's victory over 6 Zeros in 8 minutes crystallized broader patterns. They demonstrated in miniature what was happening across the Pacific Theater throughout 1944 and 1945. American forces were systematically defeating Japanese resistance through superior technology, better training, overwhelming material resources, and evolved tactics that neutralized Japanese advantages. Each engagement, each victory, each destroyed Japanese aircraft represented another step toward inevitable Japanese defeat. For DeLong personally, the engagement remained the defining moment of his combat experience. In 8 minutes, he had faced odds that should have been overwhelming, made decisions that could easily have been fatal, and through skill, training, and the capabilities of his aircraft, achieved a victory that seemed almost impossible. He had protected the fleet, destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, and survived to continue fighting. It was professional aviation combat at the highest level, the kind of performance that training and doctrine aimed to produce but rarely achieved so completely. The story serves as testament to the importance of tactical adaptation, technological superiority, and training quality in modern warfare. It demonstrates that numerical superiority alone does not guarantee victory when opponents possess overwhelming advantages in other dimensions. It illustrates the harsh mathematics of aerial combat, where small differences in pilot skill and aircraft performance compound into vast disparities in outcomes. And it reminds us that warfare is ultimately about individual human beings making split-second decisions under extreme stress, with consequences measured in lives lost or saved. The 6 Japanese pilots who died that day were not inferior as men or as warriors. They were trained professionals doing their duty as they understood it, but they were fighting with obsolescent equipment, inadequate training, and tactical doctrine that no longer corresponded to battlefield realities. They faced an opponent who possessed every advantage: better aircraft, better training, better tactics, and the confidence that comes from knowing you hold these advantages. The outcome was predetermined by factors far beyond individual courage or skill. In 8 minutes over the East China Sea, the broader strategic realities of the Pacific War found expression in one furious engagement that left 6 aircraft falling into the ocean and 1 Corsair climbing away, low on fuel and ammunition but victorious. The engagement stands as a historical moment when individual combat reflected strategic truth. Japan had lost the war for air superiority over the Pacific. Individual Japanese pilots might still achieve victories through skill or fortune, but the overall pattern was irreversible. American dominance was complete, systematic, and unchallengeable, given the resources both sides could bring to bear. DeLong's victory was not exceptional in the sense of being unique. Similar engagements occurred throughout the Pacific during 1944 and 45, American pilots routinely defeating superior numbers of Japanese aircraft through tactical superiority and technological advantage. What makes this particular engagement memorable is its clarity, the stark simplicity of 6 against 1 resulting in complete American victory, a microcosm of the larger war distilled into 8 minutes of combat. The lessons remain relevant for understanding modern aerial warfare. Technology matters, training matters, tactics matter, industrial capacity matters. No single factor determines outcomes, but the combination of advantages across multiple dimensions creates overwhelming superiority. Japan's aviation forces in 1945 lacked advantages in any category. They fought with courage and determination, but courage cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in equipment, training, numbers, and tactical doctrine. The result was inevitable, written in the physics of aerial combat and the mathematics of attrition. Philip DeLong's 8 minutes over Okinawa on April 15th, 1945 demonstrated these realities with brutal clarity. 6 Japanese fighters destroyed, 0 American losses, 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, perfect execution of tactical doctrine against numerically superior opposition. It was everything the American training system aimed to produce, everything the Corsair was designed to achieve, everything 3 years of tactical evolution had worked toward. And it was unremarkable in the sense that American pilots were achieving similar results across the Pacific theater, day after day, mission after mission, grinding down Japanese resistance through systematic application of superior resources, technology, and training. The engagement deserves remembering not because it was unique, but because it was typical of American dominance in the Pacific by 1945. One more example of why Japan's defeat was certain regardless of individual valor or tactical skill. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.